Some connections feel different from the beginning. Not louder, not more dramatic. Different. You meet hundreds of people throughout your life. Most arrive, most leave, and eventually their presence fades into memory. But every so often, someone enters your life, and something unusual happens. You cannot fully explain them. You cannot fully dismiss them. And no matter how much time passes, some invisible thread seems to remain. According to Carl Jung, certain encounters affect us so deeply because they activate parts of the psyche that were waiting to be discovered. This does not necessarily mean fate in the romantic sense. It means something inside you recognizes something important, something unfinished, something unconscious, something capable of changing who you are. Because the most significant relationships rarely begin with certainty. They begin with recognition, a strange feeling that this person matters, even when logic cannot explain why. Carl Jung believed that human beings are constantly projecting unconscious aspects of themselves onto others. Qualities they admire, qualities they fear, qualities they have not yet fully integrated. This is why certain people feel impossible to forget. They awaken parts of you that had been sleeping, a hidden desire, a buried wound, an unexplored strength, a forgotten dream. And suddenly the connection becomes larger than attraction, larger than chemistry, larger than circumstance. Because now the relationship is acting as a mirror, and mirrors are difficult to ignore. This is one of the first signs that a connection carries unusual psychological significance. The person continues appearing in your thoughts long after the interaction ends. Not because you are obsessed, because something remains unresolved. The psyche keeps returning to what it believes is important, to what it still needs to understand, to what it still needs to integrate. Most people assume meaningful relationships are defined by constant closeness. But Jung understood something deeper. Sometimes the most transformative connections are marked by periods of distance, silence, confusion, separation. Not because the bond lacks meaning, because growth is often required before two people can truly meet each other. Many individuals enter relationships searching for completion, searching for someone to rescue them from loneliness, searching for someone to heal wounds they have never confronted themselves. But relationships built on unconscious need eventually become prisons. The most powerful connections challenge both people to become more conscious, more honest, more whole. This is why truly significant relationships often feel unsettling initially. They expose insecurities, attachment patterns, fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability, fear of being fully seen. And yet, despite these fears, something keeps drawing the individuals back toward reflection, back toward awareness, back toward growth. Carl Jung believed that what affects us most deeply is not always the person themselves. It is what they awaken inside us. And perhaps this is why certain connections refuse to disappear, because they are connected to a lesson the psyche is not finished teaching, a truth not yet fully understood, a part of yourself still waiting to emerge. And when two people share that kind of connection, there are signs neither of them can fully escape. And perhaps this is where the connection begins becoming impossible to ignore. Because once a relationship reaches a certain psychological depth, it starts leaving traces everywhere. Not necessarily in the external world first, but within the mind, within the emotions, within the unconscious. According to Carl Jung, the psyche pays attention to what it considers meaningful. This is why certain people continue appearing in your thoughts long after logic says they should have faded away. Most connections disappear naturally. Time passes. Life moves forward. Attention shifts elsewhere. But psychologically significant relationships behave differently. The mind keeps returning to them, not because of obsession alone, because the connection activated something unfinished, something important, something the unconscious still wants to understand. And this becomes one of the first signs that two people share a bond larger than ordinary attraction. Neither person can fully move on internally until the lesson hidden within the connection becomes conscious. This is why some individuals find themselves thinking about someone unexpectedly, During ordinary moments, a song plays, a memory appears, a conversation triggers an association, and suddenly the person returns to awareness again, not because they were searching for them, because the psyche continues pulling attention toward what carries emotional significance. Carl Jung understood that meaningful relationships often become containers for psychological growth. The other person becomes a mirror, a reflection, a catalyst. They reveal things about us that might have remained hidden otherwise. And this leads to another sign that is difficult to escape. The relationship changes both people, even when they are apart. Most people assume relationships only matter while they are actively happening. But significant connections continue influencing individuals long after distance appears. A person begins questioning old beliefs, old fears, old emotional patterns. They become more self-aware, more conscious, more reflective, not because someone forced them to change, because the connection exposed aspects of themselves they could no longer ignore. And this is where things become fascinating psychologically. Many people mistake emotional intensity for compatibility, but Jung would likely argue that intensity alone proves very little. What matters is transformation, because some people excite you, while others awaken you. The first creates temporary emotion. The second creates permanent change. And meaningful relationships almost always belong to the second category. You begin seeing yourself differently, understanding yourself differently. Even your future begins looking different. Not because another person completed you, because they revealed parts of yourself waiting to emerge. And perhaps this is why such connections often feel strangely familiar. Many people describe this sensation as if they have known the person before, not necessarily in a mystical sense. Psychologically, the person feels familiar because they resonate with something already living inside the unconscious. A forgotten longing, a hidden value, a buried aspect of identity. Carl Jung believed human beings are constantly seeking wholeness, and sometimes certain people seem to embody qualities the psyche is trying to integrate. This creates powerful attraction, not merely attraction to the person, attraction to the possibility of becoming more fully yourself. And when this happens, another sign begins appearing. The connection repeatedly returns despite attempts to escape it. Now, this does not mean every relationship should be pursued endlessly, nor does it mean every separation is meant to end in reunion. But psychologically meaningful relationships often refuse simple dismissal. People try to forget, try to distract themselves, try to convince themselves the connection never mattered. Yet something continues pulling their attention back toward reflection, back toward understanding, back toward unfinished emotional truth. Because avoidance rarely resolves what the psyche considers important. Carl Jung understood that whatever remains unconscious continues seeking expression. This is why unresolved feelings often resurface repeatedly, not to torment us, to teach us, to reveal something we have not fully understood yet. And perhaps this leads to one of the most powerful signs of all. Growth begins replacing fantasy. In ordinary attraction, people often become attached to an image, a fantasy, a projection. But in psychologically significant relationships, something different happens. The connection gradually pushes both individuals toward greater authenticity. Masks begin falling away. Pretenses become exhausting. The desire to be understood becomes stronger than the desire to appear perfect. Because meaningful connections have a strange effect on the human psyche. They make performance feel empty and truth feel necessary. Carl Jung believed that genuine relationships require the courage to be seen, not the idealized self, the real self, the insecure self, the wounded self, the evolving self. And this is why truly important connections often feel both comforting and terrifying simultaneously. Comforting because they offer recognition, terrifying because they demand honesty. They expose fears of rejection, fears of vulnerability, fears of inadequacy. Yet despite these fears, the connection continues inviting both people toward greater self-awareness. toward greater authenticity, toward greater psychological growth. And perhaps that is why some relationships remain unforgettable. Not because they were perfect, not because they were easy, but because they awakened something that could never go back to sleep. Something inside both individuals changed. And once genuine transformation begins, it becomes very difficult to pretend the connection meant nothing at all. And this is where the connection often becomes most confusing. Because if two people affect each other this deeply, why do they sometimes pull away? Why does distance appear? Why does silence emerge? Why do individuals who seem profoundly connected sometimes struggle to stay close? According to Carl Jung, the answer often has less to do with love itself and more to do with what love awakens. Because meaningful relationships do not merely reveal our strengths, they reveal our wounds. And wounds rarely remain comfortable once they are exposed. This is why one of the most overlooked signs of a deeply significant connection is not constant harmony. It is emotional confrontation, not confrontation with each other, confrontation with the self. A person who fears abandonment suddenly becomes aware of how deeply they crave reassurance. A person who hides behind independence discovers how much they fear vulnerability. A person who built their identity around being strong begins confronting emotions they have spent years suppressing. And all of this can feel overwhelming. Because the connection is no longer simply about another person. It has become a mirror reflecting parts of the psyche that have remained hidden for years. Carl Jung believed that human beings often resist the very experiences capable of transforming them. Not because they dislike growth, because growth requires uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens the ego. The ego prefers what is familiar, even familiar suffering. This is why people sometimes retreat from relationships that matter deeply. Not because the connection lacks meaning, because the meaning feels too powerful, too exposing, too real. Suddenly, the individual can no longer hide behind old defenses. The walls they spent years building begin cracking. And while one part of them longs for intimacy, another part fears it completely. This creates a strange psychological paradox. The closer the connection feels, the stronger the urge to run. Many people misinterpret this dynamic. They assume distance automatically means lack of feeling. But Jung understood that intense emotional significance often activates equally intense fear. Because genuine intimacy requires surrender. It requires allowing another person to see aspects of yourself you normally keep hidden. And for someone carrying unresolved wounds, that can feel terrifying. This is why another sign appears repeatedly in meaningful relationships. The individuals keep teaching each other lessons they never intended to teach. Without realizing it, they expose each other's patterns. One reveals the other's fear of rejection. One reveals the other's tendency toward self-protection. One reveals the other's difficulty receiving love. One reveals the other's fear of being fully known. And while these revelations can create tension, they also create growth. Because what becomes conscious can finally begin transforming. Carl Jung believed that relationships often serve as vehicles for individuation. The process of becoming who you truly are. Not who fear taught you to become. Not who society expects you to become. Who you genuinely are beneath the layers of adaptation. This is why some relationships seem to arrive at exactly the moment they are needed. Not necessarily when they are wanted. Needed. The connection appears when certain lessons are ready to emerge. When certain fears are ready to be confronted. When certain parts of the self are ready to awaken. And once that process begins, life rarely returns to the way it was before. Because awareness changes everything. The individual begins recognizing patterns they once ignored. They notice how often fear influences decisions, how often insecurity disguises itself as logic, how often self-protection prevents genuine intimacy. And perhaps this is why significant relationships leave such lasting marks. Even if circumstances become complicated, even if distance exists, even if timing feels imperfect, the psychological impact remains. Because the connection has already altered the way both people understand themselves. And then another sign begins emerging. The relationship becomes less about possession and more about growth. This is a profound shift. In ordinary attachment, the focus is often, how do I keep this person? But in meaningful connections, a deeper question appears. What is this relationship teaching me? That question changes everything. Because now the connection is no longer evaluated solely through immediate outcomes. It is understood through transformation, through awareness, through the evolution it creates within both individuals. Carl Jung believed that love at its highest form encourages consciousness. It does not demand blindness. It encourages growth. Growth toward authenticity. Growth toward wholeness. Growth toward becoming more fully yourself. And perhaps that is one of the clearest signs that two people share something extraordinary. The relationship continually pushes both individuals toward greater truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, even when it challenges old identities, even when it requires letting go of illusions. Because truly meaningful connections are not sustained by fantasy. They are sustained by reality, the reality of being seen, the reality of being known, the reality of standing before another human being without masks. And while many people spend their lives searching for someone who understands them, the deeper challenge is allowing yourself to be understood. That is where genuine intimacy begins. That is where real transformation begins. And that is why certain connections become impossible to forget. Not because they fulfilled every desire, but because they awakened a version of yourself that could no longer remain asleep. And perhaps this brings us to the deepest sign of all, the sign that exists beneath every other sign, beneath the thoughts, the synchronicities, the emotional intensity, the distance, the longing, the growth. Because according to Carl Jung, the most meaningful relationships are not defined by how strongly two people feel about each other. They are defined by who those two people become because of each other. That is the difference. Many relationships create excitement. Few create transformation. And transformation is difficult to ignore. Because once two people have genuinely changed each other's inner world, something remains. Even if years pass, even if circumstances shift, even if life moves in unexpected directions, the impact remains. Not necessarily as attachment, not necessarily as longing, but as awareness. The relationship becomes woven into the story of who they are. Carl Jung believed that the human psyche is always moving toward greater wholeness, toward individuation, toward becoming the most authentic version of itself. And sometimes another person becomes part of that journey, not because they complete you, because they help reveal what was already within you. This is why the deepest connections often feel less like finding someone new and more like remembering something forgotten. A forgotten strength, a forgotten truth, a forgotten part of yourself. The other person becomes a catalyst, not the destination. And perhaps this is where many people misunderstand the phrase, meant to be. They imagine it means two people will never struggle, never separate, never face uncertainty. But meaningful relationships rarely unfold that way. In reality, the most significant connections often demand growth before union, self-awareness before intimacy, wholeness before stability. Because two people cannot build something healthy while unconsciously expecting the other person to heal what they refuse to confront themselves. Carl Jung understood that love without consciousness often becomes dependency, possession, projection, fantasy. But love combined with awareness becomes something entirely different. A force for transformation. A force that encourages both individuals to become more honest, more authentic, more integrated, more fully themselves. And perhaps that is why certain signs become impossible to escape. Not because the universe is forcing two people together, because growth keeps pointing them toward the same truth, the same lesson, the same opportunity for greater consciousness. The connection continues inviting them to evolve, to examine their fears, to confront their shadows, to remove the masks they have worn for years. And whether they accept that invitation or not, the relationship leaves its mark, because meaningful encounters always do. Carl Jung believed that what affects us most deeply is rarely what happens externally. It is what happens internally because of it. And this is why some people remain unforgettable. Not because they were perfect, not because the relationship was easy, but because they awakened something profound, something real, something that changed the way we see ourselves forever. Perhaps that is the final sign. You cannot return to who you were before. The connection expanded your awareness. It challenged your assumptions. It exposed your fears. It revealed your capacity for love, vulnerability, and growth. And once that happens, the psyche remembers, because transformation leaves footprints on the soul. So if there is someone who continually returns to your thoughts, someone whose presence changed the way you understand yourself, someone who pushed you toward greater honesty, greater awareness, and greater growth, perhaps the most important question is not, are we meant to be together? Perhaps the deeper question is, what is this connection trying to teach me? Because when that lesson becomes conscious, everything changes. And sometimes, paradoxically, it is only when two people stop desperately trying to force an outcome that they become capable of creating something real, something grounded, something conscious, something lasting. So write this in the comments. I choose growth over illusion. Not because every connection is meant to last forever, but because every meaningful connection has the power to transform you. And if this journey into Jungian psychology, shadow work, emotional intelligence, individuation, and the hidden dynamics of human connection resonated with you, stay with inner Phoria, because the relationships that change your life most profoundly are often the ones that first teach you who you truly are.